The prospect of this possible pipeline prompted reaction from several BC Liberal MPs last week.
What's important is what Minister Hodgson and the Prime Minister said, is that for any projects, particularly anything that's going to be listed on the national project or the major projects list, it's going to have provincial buy-in and Indigenous support.
There has to be Indigenous consent. The province's impact have to be on board, and those are the conditions. And right now, I don't see that. And it's all hypothetical.
Projects would need the support of the jurisdictions in which they're being built. So I think there's got to be some conversations with the Premier. And in terms of First Nations, I mean, there needs to be significant support. It doesn't necessarily have to be unanimous. It wasn't in the case of Trans Mountain, but there needs to be significant support. And at the present time, I don't think there is.
Okay, so that was then. How do these Liberals feel now that we know more about that deal? Joining me now is BC Liberal MP Jonathan Wilkinson, who also previously served as the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Jonathan Wilkinson, it's good to see you, sir. Thank you for being here today.
Good to see you. Thank you very much.
I've been speaking with members of the Liberal caucus, and in particular the BC Liberal caucus, who use the words seething, anxious, and angry to describe their reaction to news of an MOU coming on Thursday with Alberta. How would you describe what is happening right now?
Well, I guess what I would say, whether it's to my colleagues or others, is everybody should take a little bit of a breath. You know, at the end of the day, let's see what the MOU says when it actually comes out. I am quite confident that that the MOU will contain a number of the provisions that the Prime Minister has said publicly before, which is, you know, need to seek the support of the jurisdiction in which a project takes place, and needs to have significant support amongst Indigenous communities, and ultimately it needs to ensure that we are also thinking, if projects move ahead, that we account for any incremental emissions, and those are accommodated in the context of an updated climate plan. So all of those things I think are important, but we shouldn't prejudge sort of what's in the MOU before it's actually unveiled.
But the idea of the MOU is to move towards an eventual bitumen pipeline. I mean, obviously, Alberta is acting as the proponent now. This is to clear a path for them to maybe find a private sector proponent. And as I understand it, Mr. Wilkinson, Alberta will be expected to engage with British Columbia and the First Nations to get their whatever level of support they can get there if they're going to function as the proponent. But a lot of your colleagues are just worried about the political costs of that, because it has been an article of faith for the last 10 years, no northern pipeline through British Columbia with the Liberal Party of Canada. And now it seems like it's a possibility.
Well, again, I just think people need to take a bit of a step back. I mean, for all major projects, whether it's this project or it's liquid natural gas or mines or transmission lines, there will always be concerns that are raised with respect to how do you do this in a manner that promotes economic opportunity, but is consistent with, you know, commitments to Indigenous communities, that are consistent with environmental obligations. I would say that opposition to a bitumen pipeline typically falls on worries about environmental impacts, and that's particularly true in the North Coast. Like, people forget that the tanker ban that was formalized under Mr. Trudeau, it was a moratorium since 1972, and it relates to the difficulty in terms of navigation on the North Coast. It relates to the fact that infrastructure that exists in the Vancouver Harbor does not exist up there to ensure that you can actually address issues as they arise effectively. And it's also concerns that Indigenous communities have, and Indigenous communities have a constitutional right to be consulted and accommodated. So those are very legitimate concerns. By the same token, you know, oil and gas are fully legal products in the same way that electricity is. And so engaging a conversation about whether this is something that works environmentally, that works in terms of First Nations engagement, that works economically is always going to be healthy.
Right, but here we are, you know, Mr. Wilkinson, the consumer carbon tax is gone. The emissions cap, there's a pathway to never implementing that thing spelled out in the budget. There's a willingness now to consider lifting the moratorium on tankers on the north coast of BC over the objections of the BC government and a lot of the coastal First Nations. And, you know, there's reports, or we're being told of a clean electricity regulation carve out for Alberta in this MOU. Many of the pillars of the environmental agenda of the last 10 years gone. in the words of one MP I spoke with, in the singular obsession of trying to satisfy Danielle Smith. I mean, how comfortable are you with that as a minister who was part of a lot of this, or former minister who was part of a lot of this, and someone who represents a British Columbia riding?
Well, look, I think the Prime Minister's been quite clear that, this kind of a project's not going to get imposed over British Columbia, and it will require the support of significant proportion of First Nations that are impacted. So my expectation is the MOU actually says that those kinds of conversations need to be engaged. So am I concerned about that? No, because at the end of the day, the Prime Minister has made clear the position that those issues need to be engaged and addressed. In terms of the climate stuff, I mean, for sure, there have been some changes, some of which, like the consumer carbon price, as somebody who is a supporter of that, I think it's unfortunate because it was good public policy, but it was done because Mr. Polyev had created such a toxic environment around it that it just wasn't worth that kind of a debate in the public sphere. But it is true to say that the government is going to need to come forward with an updated climate plan that actually demonstrates how it's going to continue to make progress. We should all expect that when we put together a plan, that there will be adjustments to it. I mean, I helped to create the first plan that showed how we would meet a target in this country, but I didn't think that everything that we put into there was gospel, that at some point there would be some changes that would be made. It's incumbent now on the government to sort of talk about how it's going to move forward on a number of these issues. That's going to be up to Minister de Bruzen and the Prime Minister. But I would note that the Prime Minister reiterated in the House of Commons last week, in response to a question from Elizabeth May, that Canada remains committed to working towards the climate targets that we established.
Right.
And that can be done in many different ways.
But I wonder, David Eby has made it very clear that, in his view, this attempt at whatever the MOU does to accelerate the push towards the bitumen pipeline, it threatens the very real economic development ambitions of the coastal First Nations and the government of British Columbia. That the social license they have gotten with a lot of those First Nations groups for LNG pipelines and LNG facilities, critical minerals potentially, power lines through territory, that rests on the integrity and the maintaining of the oil tanker ban. Do you agree with David Eby's characterization of how fragile this is and how this is kind of the oil tanker ban is like a key Jenga piece in the whole plan? It could come out and it could all fall down. Is it truly at that level of risk here?
Well, I think Premier Eby's concerns are legitimate. I mean, the government of British Columbia has spent a lot of time working towards enabling the development of a number of LNG facilities that have, created significant investment in this country and probably will create significant additional investment in this country. And the coastal First Nations in particular have, worked with their communities to gather the support that allows them, in many cases, to participate economically in those developments. So when Premier Eby raises concerns about disturbing that, I think we should take him at his word that this is a legitimate concern. And I've heard some similar things from coastal First Nations themselves. That doesn't mean you can't engage a conversation about what underpins those concerns and whether there are ways to address them. I'm not saying there are, but I'm saying it's totally legitimate to engage those kinds of conversations while understanding that the things that Premier Eby says, I know he believes, and I actually think that he has worked extremely hard, as did John Horgan, to try to enable a lot of these things. And I think we should, ensure that we're not destabilizing that. But I don't think conversations do that, and maybe there are pathways through. Maybe.
Okay, but if this does potentially put the economic ambitions of British Columbia at risk, that is going to have some serious consequences economically, politically, socially, and certainly on the Federation. But, if this MOU, with all of the expectations, is building in Alberta, merely leads to conversations but doesn't lead to a pipeline, you can see a lot of Albertans seeing this as another bait and switch, and it could just inflame an anger that's out there if it doesn't actually yield results beyond process, because I don't think that's what Danielle Smith is looking for. I think she's looking for an actual pipeline. So there is this balancing act. Mr. Wilkinson seems very fraught with a lot of downside risk on either side of the Rocky Mountains.
Well, I would say federalism at times is messy, and different provinces have different perspectives and at times different interests. That doesn't mean you can't engage those conversations and try to come to outcomes that can be mutually understood and ideally mutually beneficial. I would say, though, that there has been an enormous amount of progress made for projects relating to oil and gas over the past 10 years. Like people forget, like Trans Mountain was built under the Trudeau government. And it has had enormous economic benefits for Alberta. We've seen, dramatic investments in liquid natural gas. That's LNG Canada 1, that's wood fiber, that's Cedar LNG, now it's Lims, and maybe LNG Canada 2, which looks like it will likely move forward. And that actually benefits all of Canada, but certainly British Columbia and Alberta collectively.
Right.
And in terms of additional egress for bitumen, I mean, there is the Trans Mountain pipeline upgrade, which would enhance production by the ability to flow about, I don't know, 400,000 barrels of oil, and the main line that Enbridge is upgrading, which would do something similar. So there's close to 1 million barrels already with respect to projects that would be delivered more quickly. So, lots of things to talk about where the interests of Alberta and British Columbia are more or less aligned. But this other project, there are concerns, and they're legitimate concerns, and they need to be addressed, and it will take some time.
But just as a final point, Mr. Wilkinson, I remember essentially when Northern Gateway was ruled out by former Prime Minister Trudeau. There was no consent from the First Nations. It's an environmentally sensitive ecosystem. You don't want oil tankers going through there, sensitive terrain on the ocean. And it would have to go through the Great Bear Rainforest, if I'm remembering the name of the area correctly. None of that's changed. I know the trade relationship with the U.S. has changed, and I know the occupant of the Prime Minister's office has changed, but the fundamental reasons for never doing this are still there. Is this just because the Liberal Party's under new management?
Well, first of all, I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's no specific route that's been selected, and I doubt there will be until you're a little bit farther along in the process. So in terms of exactly where it goes, I'm not sure anybody knows where that would be.
Well, Danielle Smith does talk about Prince Rupert, though. Just that is what she constantly says, right? So we know the general destination.
Yeah, the general destination. In terms of the Great Bear Rainforest, I'm not, I don't think any of us knows exactly what the route would be. But I would say concerns on the part of Indigenous communities remain. And while people say that it was Prime Minister Trudeau who actually killed it, I mean, largely it was killed by Indigenous opposition that the courts upheld.
Sure.
And so those kinds of issues are going to have to be addressed. Can they be addressed? I don't know. I mean, can you actually convince coastal First Nations that this is something that's actually in their interest and can be done safely? I don't know. And that's a bar, and it's a high bar. The same thing is true with respect to navigation and the infrastructure that would need to be put into place. Like even here in Vancouver Harbor, where we have a lot of infrastructure to be able to manage the kinds of flows that are going on here, we put in place the Oceans Protection Plan, which was, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to actually ensure that this could be done in a safe way. Those similar kinds of investments would have to be made in other areas if, in fact, you were going to do the same thing. So, again, lots of things to work through. I don't think it behooves any of us in this federation to prejudge the outcome. That being said, I do think the concerns are important and need to be well considered.
Jonathan Wilkinson, well, I'll take a breath maybe until Thursday, and then we'll see whether we yell or sigh in relief. We'll see, depending on how people react to it. Jonathan Wilkinson, we appreciate your time. Thanks for being here, sir.
All right, thanks a lot.
So is this potential pipeline revealing fault lines in the Liberal caucus? We're going to dig into that now with the Power Panel. Emily Nicola is a columnist for Le Devoir. Supriya Dwivedi was an advisor to former Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister. And here with me in the studio, Matthew Dubé is a former NDP MP. Supriya, Elizabeth May is not wrong. BC Liberals do like their seats, and they are worried about their seats based on the conversations me and my colleagues have been having today. They've told me flat out, many of them, they are more in line with David Eby on this than with Mark Carney on this. And Tim Hodgson is going to BC caucus in the morning to brief them because of what is happening there, because they have not been briefed so far. So 8:30 tomorrow morning, the energy minister is going to be there. What do you make of the way this is playing out with the Liberals?
It seems like, okay, so there's two things, right? I mean, the fact that Minister Hodgson now has to go to BC caucus tomorrow before National Caucus to kind of brief them on what's going on, pardon me, it says to me that it wasn't properly, doled out, right? Like this shouldn't have had to be added to his schedule last minute. They probably should have talked to their MPs in British Columbia prior to this going out and prior to, Premier Eby publicly disagreeing with the way that the PM has gone about it to begin with. So I think all of that's to be is a fault, in terms of the government, how they did that. But the flip side of that is that basically everything we've seen and heard from this government has been pointing towards, coming to some sort of deal with Alberta to get a pipeline to Tidewater. So I don't understand why the MPs would be, feel like they were blindsided or that this is out of pocket or some sort of offside thing. I think there's the other cause for concern here, if you do have a more environmentally conscious sort of mindset, is that, going forward with the stricter industrial carbon pricing is good if that is what Alberta is going to have to hold up on their end. But the carbon capture stuff is still really up in the air. It's never been deployed at scale. It's pretty expensive to run. It doesn't count for any of the downstream emissions that are then going to be used from that oil and gas. So there's still, and again, I'm happy to be proven wrong on the carbon capture, but there's all sorts of reasons to worry. Yeah.
So Lisa, just so people understand the broad outline of what we know about this deal, that essentially Alberta will agree to, a more rigorous industrial carbon pricing. The Pathways project will have to go ahead, and in return for that, that and methane regulations, no emissions cap. Some carve out on the clean electricity regulations, and also a willingness to at least lift to some degree the tanker ban, provided there's an actual pipeline project to approve. But then after this is signed, Alberta has to go deal with BC, Alberta has to go deal with the First Nations in British Columbia, and they have to figure out a proponent. So that's the broad outlines of it. It's not necessarily a pipeline deal, but it's laying conditions and a track for it that a lot of Liberals we spoke with today are not comfortable with and not happy about.
Well, you missed one overall condition that needs to be taken into consideration. It's not 10 years ago. The economy is not strong. And our prospects for trade with the United States diminish and dim as the day goes by. And that hurts real people. Real people around the country are going to start losing their jobs. And we are going to need a source of revenue in this country. And the best source of revenue we have in this country, like it or not, folks, is an oil pipeline or a gas pipeline in order to bring in the royalties and to create the economies that we're going to need to get through a very difficult time. What I find interesting about the Prime Minister's comment, he said that the conditions are necessary, but they're maybe not sufficient.
Yeah.
Which means that he's admitting that all of the conditions that they are reversing in this MOU, they needed to get rid of them in order to have any prospect of hope for a pipeline. So they're going to get rid of them, or they're going to mitigate them. And that means whether or not the Albertan government is able to put together a deal that will be sufficient for a proponent to come to the table, well, that's going to be up to them. But I would say that right now, the Prime Minister may be saying it's a clear and bold line. This is as far as we're going, and this is all we're going to go to. And that's probably what he's going to tell BC caucus, to be honest. But he'll be tested again and again as this unfolds, because the pressure to have an economy that works is going to build. And that is what gets you unelected.
Yeah, Matthew, the necessary conditions versus sufficient conditions, I take it as, the feds in Alberta have done what they can do. Now it's up to Alberta to do the BC and Indigenous thing to get it over the line and get a proponent there. Whatever that means, we'll find out Thursday when we get the full formal details. But the political backlash here, British Columbia is getting angrier about this, and the BC caucus is seething, angry, furious were the words used in my conversations with people today. How do you see it all?
Well, and I think too, you just think of Premier Eby's perspective, right? This is a guy who has spent an enormous amount of political capital helping projects move along that are unpopular with members of his own party. And you see that reflected even at the leadership review a couple of weeks ago, where it wasn't a disaster, it was 83%. It's obviously a good number, but it still shows that discontent is there. But he's willing to take these chances to be a team player, understanding what the implications are, all these external factors that we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about, trade tensions, all that sort of thing. So it's hard for me to understand why it would be politically acceptable or wise to exclude someone who's clearly willing to make those compromises in favor of a premier in Danielle Smith, who clearly is not.
But they'll be coming into the process now, it seems, right?
Sure.
Like, you know what I mean? Like Alberta and the feds needed to figure out if they could find somewhere to work. Like, and I get David Eby's frustration, but they come into it now, it seems.
Yeah, but I mean, like, everyone keeps saying, you know, federalism is complicated. Well, you're certainly going to make it more complicated when you start a conversation with only one other premier in the room and then say, now go figure it out and adding in the other premier. It just doesn't really make much sense. And I think the ramifications on that front are larger. Like, as a former Quebec MP, my instinct immediately kicked in, and I'm like, when are we next? When are we going to get treated this way by the Prime Minister, right? Like, that's the broader implication, is that if the Prime Minister is willing to entertain this side conversation with one premier, potentially at the detriment of another, you know, when does the other shoe drop for someone else? And I think it creates a climate of potentially of mistrust in that respect. So I think that's also politically damaging as well. But yeah, there's a lot of implications beyond this immediate issue, which is obviously going to be a big one too.
Yeah, I think that maybe a bit of an understatement even. But, you know, Emily, I wonder, the necessary conditions, as Mark Carney talks about, but not necessarily the sufficient conditions. You give Alberta the hope of a pipeline with this. If that next step to what is sufficient doesn't happen, the frustration potential there is high, and like the Rocky Mountains is going to become a real dividing line on this politically.
If we imagine that Alberta was always a country, say Confederation never happened, they would have to, if they wanted, they're still landlocked. If they want a pipeline, they still want to negotiate with BC. And if that world, if in that world First Nations rights still exist, then it doesn't get done if First Nations don't agree. And that's the situation that Mark Carney is creating now. So I think what he's trying to do, in part, is saying to the Premier of Alberta, you want your pipeline, go ahead and try to figure out one. And if it doesn't work because the private sector doesn't want it, BC doesn't want it, First Nations in BC don't want it, then Alberta cannot blame Ottawa anymore. And I think that's the only thing that Mark Carney has to win in this, is that he cannot be the target of Alberta's ire anymore by doing this. And the pipeline doesn't get done. There's also people who are blindsided inside the Liberal caucus, because there was this hope until now that the question to what does Alberta want would be answered by Keystone through the US and not have to build a pipeline within Canada. That's what's changing about this. And so because of that situation, I think what Mark Carney is trying to do is please Alberta, get them some restriction, and also in a situation in which maybe there's not even a pipeline that actually exists, and win-win on all sides. I think what's actually likely to happen is that he's going to lose on all sides. He's losing his caucus in the West. He's losing the people who are caring about the environment in his own caucus, and he's going to disappoint Albertans as well, because they're going to face reality that people in BC don't want this.
Right. So Priya, that's what I wonder. Yeah, I mean, that's what I wonder about when I was sort of doing the calculus today and talking to people, and that the Liberal caucus has gone along with a lot of things since the management change that they weren't 100% comfortable with, right? And for some of them, something like this could be a bridge too far. I don't know. But, you know, I was having conversations today that reminded me of, was it last summer, Toronto St. Paul, and then LaSalle-Mar, just the frustration with not knowing and not understanding and not hearing and feeling politically exposed and at risk, you know, for something that is not necessarily guaranteed to deliver the GDP needle-moving project that a pipeline could potentially be.
Cochran, I thought you were going to give me a trigger warning of talking about St. Paul's, and now. Sorry,
Supriya.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think everything you're saying is quite right. And, you know, to Emily's point, I think the last point is the correct one, is that the Prime Minister is trying to do is to bring forward, you know, all these different opposing sides, and try and win everyone over. But what may end up indeed happening is that you're going to please nobody in the end, and you get a bunch of people that are pissed off. The one difference I will say, and that's not to diminish the the clear kind of anger that is currently running through certain parts of the Liberal caucus, but until somebody's willing to put a name up to it, or until there's it ends up being a little bit clearer about who exactly is angry and just how angry they are. From a caucus management perspective, it's difficult to kind of quell those concerns or doubts, however you want to qualify it,
right,
if they're not coming forward to, the PM and his team themselves.
Yeah, I don't think we're at the letter writing campaign stage, but there's another trigger warning. But there is a frustration and stuff definitely happening there. But Lisa, I wonder. The Prime Minister did say something in question period today that we feel BC would need to agree. Now, the Conservatives have jumped on that and said, "Oh, that's giving British Columbia a veto." I sought clarity on that and was told we shouldn't conclude that, but then when I asked for clarification, none was immediately forthcoming. So if it isn't a veto, it leaves the impression that potentially, if BC doesn't agree, it doesn't go ahead. How do you expect this to play out? Because I don't see David Eby agreeing, certainly in the current state. They run environmental risk with a pipeline going through their territory without necessarily getting the economic rent. They don't get royalties and these things. So do you cut them into the deal? Do you offer them a stake? Like, how does this possibly work that you get the new Democrat government of British Columbia on board with this?
Well, I mean, if every province was going to get what they were supposed to get by virtue of the fact that there's goods crossing through them, then you'd have very rich provinces across the country. And that's just not the way that it works. I think we can't think about it that way. We can't think about British Columbia holding the only tidewater in the western part of Canada. I don't think that's fair. I think you have to think about that port in Vancouver and Prince Rupert is actually a port for the entire prairies. And that's exactly how it's sold when you're building the infrastructure. Otherwise, why are we investing billions of dollars in infrastructure, in port infrastructure for one province? And if there's nothing for them, then there's nothing that's going to happen about it. So I'm going to reject that premise. On the political side of it, though, I find it interesting we're having this conversation that Liberal MPs are worried about losing their seats. When I take a look at the canvass in British Columbia, it's the Conservatives that are in second place in the province when it comes to the number of federal seats. And it's only by one. So we're not that far behind. So who's to say that it's not going to be a Conservative that's going to take that seat? And I think we're all very clear on where Conservatives stand with respect to pipelines, especially ones that are going to be bringing prosperity. So I don't necessarily ascribe to everything that's being said with respect to BC having a veto, getting back to your original question. I don't think they should. I think the Supreme Court has said they don't. And quite frankly, a negotiation should happen. But at the end of the day, David, this comes down to an election, then let's go. And let's figure out exactly what we stand for. Do we want an economic bright future? Or do we want to hold back different parts of the country because you're uncomfortable with your cut in a deal?
Yeah. Look, I don't think anyone, Matthew, is suggesting British Columbia has a legal veto, right? That was settled. We went through that with TMX, and David Eby, I think, was Solicitor General or Attorney General in the government of British Columbia at the time, so he well knows this. It's just a question of the politics around it and what the feds are willing to overlook. The Indigenous consultation is going to be a more difficult issue. I mean, what do you make of what we heard from the Conservatives saying Carney is going to let BC kill this potentially?
Well, I think you actually have to look at what BC is doing. Again, I just come back to this fact that they're not just saying no to everything. Premier Eby is putting his political neck on the line to, increase production of Trans Mountain, to approve other projects, to collaborate with First Nations in BC on other projects that they were trepidatious about, and saying, look, I've got real proponents with real projects, and I've convinced First Nations to go ahead with those. But then you're going to turn around and have me betray those nations for something that is still hypothetical, that doesn't have a proponent. And the reality is, the political reality is, because we talked about earlier the necessary conditions and the sufficient conditions, the reality is 15 years ago, we burned it all down in hopes that there would be, hey, no environmental assessment or almost next to none, and we're going to get all this stuff done. And it didn't, and it wasn't because of provinces having vetoes. It was a lack of social license. It was First Nations, and it was the private sector getting skittish and expecting government to do all the work for them. So I think when you look at that what David Eby is doing, he's trying to be a team player about it, and he's under enormous pressure from different groups within his party and within his province, and I think he's being very fair about it. And at the end of the day, if people are going to look at that and think that it's somehow a veto, I think you're missing the forest for the trees. And then you have to ask federal Conservatives, what about all the other projects that David Eby is championing in that province as well, which have major economic impacts?
Yeah, and to Lisa's point, there are 19 British Columbia Conservative MPs who may be worried a little bit about taking too hard of a line against the interests of British Columbia in this debate. Who knows, right? Depending on how their constituents react. But Emily, just your thoughts on next steps on this before I jump on to the next thing. Like Cabinet met today. Presumably they'll be going over the broad directions of where this all is going. But Thursday morning in Calgary, it's a Daniel Smith, Mark Carney press conference, and then an event at the Chamber of Commerce there.
I think the words they use is gonna matter, but that there is already some damage being done in the fact that this is done without BC and it's about BC. And I think I think the words that can be used could be as a way to, I don't know, open a hand. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. And I think that image is gonna wound some people. I also think that in the context of lumber and everything that's going on in terms of economic concerns in BC, that can create as well a what about us pandemic within the different provinces of Canada. It's either as that other provinces are going to fear to be treated like BC is going to be treated tomorrow, or that they're going to be wanting to be treated like Alberta is being treated tomorrow.
Right.
And either way, that creates a different set of expectation for Mark Carney moving forward.